Hey, what's up everyone? This is Sean Plott, aka Day9, and I am experimenting with musical interludes. That said, this audio is Hallmarks of Expert Play Part 2, Redundancy and Purpose. The two concepts I'm going to present in this audio are simple enough to state, but they have really powerful applications all throughout your gameplay. And the idea is that by keeping both of these in mind at all points in time, this will help you clean up your play a little bit and smooth things out. With that in mind, let's begin talking about redundancy. I was recently watching a friend of mine play a Zerg vs. Protoss, and when his Protoss opponent went Corsair, my friend responded by getting both an Evolution Chamber to throw down some spores, and he got a Hydralisk Den as well. Immediately I pointed out that he should do one or the other, because by getting both he's in essence double defending against Corsairs. That is, his play is redundant. You never want to end up defending against the same thing twice because it's a waste of resources, and considering how fragile of a game StarCraft is anyways, spending extra money defending the same thing more than once can lead to huge problems later on in the game. The notion of redundancy appears earliest on in a player's evolution in terms of defense. Don't make too much static defense because having a big army accomplishes the same purpose. You don't need a huge pack of cannons at the front of your base if you have enough troops to adequately defend and attack. One or the other will do just fine. I'm sure at this point many of you are thinking to yourself, yeah, well obviously I don't want to have redundant elements in my gameplay. That said, I'm bringing it up because it's really easy for this redundancy to kind of sneak up on you, that in the moment of gameplay you'll perform an action that seems totally reasonable, but it's really important to take the time and reflect and make sure that it's not an unnecessary action. So, let's do some examples. A lot of Terran players nowadays really like that Flash-style, really fast +1/+1 upgrades for their mech army. The problem is I'll see a lot of players get this armory, but then they'll also get an engineering bay and make a whole bunch of turrets around their base to hold off a shuttle harass. If you get the armory that quickly, you can get Goliaths to defend against the attack instead. By getting the armory with Goliaths and then getting a bunch of turrets, you've effectively wasted a whole bunch of minerals on the engineering bay and the turrets. On Bluestorm, you'll see Flash oftentimes when he does his signature build. He'll end up getting a handful of Goliaths to hold off the attack, and then all that money that would have been spent on turrets and an engineering bay, he can instead spend on a command center, expanding once again really quickly. So by eliminating that little bit of redundancy, he had these extra resources that he could use to his advantage. The type of play that Flash does in his style is what I would call removing redundancy outside of the game. Flash sat down before the game even started and planned out how he was going to hold off that shuttle harass and get the +1 attack upgrade. So, let me also take the time to illustrate someone playing redundantly by making poor decisions within a game. In many of the Zerg vs. Protoss games that I've played on Requiem, my Protoss opponents will opt for a 2-gate Zealot Rush aggressive opening, because the starting positions are so close, and because gaining control of someone's front ramp is absolutely critical to gameplay. Let's say I'm playing one of these types of games and the Protoss player prevents me from getting an expansion and I'm sitting in my main with 2 hatches and a bunch of zealots at my ramp. In this situation, I like to go Lurkers because it's a good way to sort of bust the ramp, and since the Protoss has me walled in, he totally gets the opportunity to see exactly what I'm doing. So now I have a Protoss opponent who opened 2-gate and knows his Zerg opponent is going Lurkers. At this point in time, my opponents generally make the exact same mistake every single time that allows me to win. They get both cannons and observers. Logically, it seems to make sense, because if you get the Forge, you can make a whole bunch of cannons on top of my ramp to sort of bolster that wall in. Additionally, you're going to get the observers, so that way you can see the Lurkers too. However, this is how the game ends up playing out. I get 4 Lurkers, a bunch of Zerglings, and I easily break the Zealot cannon contain at my front. Afterwards, by the time I get to his base, he has 2 or 3 Dragoons and an Observer that happily get to have vision of the Lurkers and Zerglings which proceed to kill him. By getting both the cannons and the Observers, the Protoss player ended up with not enough units. He was so mentally focused on detection that he sort of forgot the idea that he needs to both have stuff to kill the Lurkers and be able to see the Lurkers at the same time. Ideally, The Protoss would do one or the other. If he opts for Observers, he could go 3-gate Zealot Dragoon with Observers, and do a pretty good job of holding off this Lurker Zergling push, which is what's happened in my experience. Alternatively, he can get the Forge and the cannons and make a bunch of cannons at my ramp, holding me in, as well as a bunch of cannons outside his natural expansion. So once I do break this contain, I get to his base and I can't do anything more because there's a wall of cannons and a handful more units. And then the Protoss gets to play from there. As you slowly improve in StarCraft, not only will you see more ways to eliminate redundancy in your play, but you'll also get the opportunity to eliminate it in ways you couldn't before by using your new in-game skill. So, for example, if you're really good at watching the minimap and moving your Hydralisks around, you can delay getting Scourge against dropships, because your Hydralisks can hold off the drops just as well. Terrific. Now you're a player who's excellent at eliminating redundant components to his play. Now this brings us to the next part of this audio rant, which is the notion of purpose. Again, the notion of purpose is very simple to state, but has tremendously powerful applications to all levels of play. The notion of purpose is this. Any of the decisions that you make, such as units to build or buildings to make sure that each of them always has a purpose. And make sure it doesn't just have a one-time use sort of purpose. Make sure the purpose continues all game long. The simplest example of this concept comes in Protoss vs. Zerg when the Protoss player early expands. He gets that Forge so he can put cannons at his front and not die to any sort of early attack. However, it seems a little bit wasteful to get a Forge that fast if its only purpose is cannons. As a result, we see a lot of Protoss players get the +1 attack upgrade really quickly. As a result, the Protoss player comes out with a really big, fast +1 Zealot leg speed army. Likewise, if you're a Zerg player against a Protoss player and your opponent goes for a really fast Corsair play, if you want to make an Evolution Chamber and Spores to hold off the Corsairs, it would be a very good idea to start upgrading that +1 Carapace upgrade very early. That way your Evolution Chamber isn't going to waste just to hold off these Corsairs. At very high levels of play, making sure everything has purpose is the birthplace for some of the best builds and the most revolutionary styles we've seen to date. Consider Fantasy's Terran vs. Zerg mech build that he used in the OSL semifinals against GG Play. In these games, Fantasy opened up with really fast vultures and then got a dropship and expanded really quickly, and he used the vulture harass in the Zerg's main with this dropship to allow this expansion to get up and running safely and to potentially do a lot of damage to Zerg. Now that opening by itself is very clever because it's a great way to get a safe expansion and transition into mech. However, Fantasy brilliantly started going Valkyries the instant he got his armory up. That starport, which he got so fast for those dropships, its purpose didn't end with the dropship harass. It was immediately put into use with all these Valkyries. As a result, Fantasy didn't have to spend so much money getting a bunch of factories and a bunch of turrets early. To hold off a fast Mutilus counterattack, all Fantasy needed was 2 factories and these Valkyries. Valkyries that were key to his early game play. In another example, let's consider the modern state of Zerg vs. Protoss. A lot of Protoss players picked up on this Bisu-style build, which was dominating Zerg players for a very long time, until Zerg players started focusing on getting a bunch of Scourge early and then getting Hydralisks. That way, the Scourge would sort of negate this air control that the Corsairs provided, and the Hydralisks would allow the Zerg player to get a little bit more map control.